Welcome to the 8th episode of the ongoing series, The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness, here on Svarim Chatter. And I'm Nachi Weinstein. In this episode of the series, we discuss one of the most fascinating characters connected to the Lost Tribes, David Reuveni, a dark-skinned man who appears on the world stage in Italy in 1524, claiming to be the brother of King Yosef, who is the king of Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Reueveni ends up meeting with the Pope, the King of Portugal, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, as he attempts to secure an army to take the Holy Land back from the Muslims. Reueveni, along the way, inspires converso or Moranos in Portugal to return to Judaism, including one Diego Pires, who ends up becoming Shlomo Molcho, who is burned at the stake after his meeting with Reueveni, with the Emperor Charles V. Reueveni himself also suffers the same unfortunate end of being burned at the stake, and he has the distinction of being perhaps the only unconverted Jew ever to be burned at the stake. As for listeners who are familiar from the Spain series in Svarim Chatter, the Inquisition in general only had jurisdiction over Christians or converted Jews, not just a Jew. So Reueveni has that, unfortunate end. But this diary, what we're discussing here in this episode, which the new translation is Diary of a Black Jewish Messiah, the 17th century journey of David Reuveni through Africa, the Middle East, and Europe by Professor Alan Verskin, is a wonderful translation. And while much of this story and this diary really concerns Reueveni and his story, the 10 Lost Tribes is an overarching theme throughout, as that's his claim. And I highly recommend this book. I don't usually make recommendations, but I do highly recommend this to anyone interested in Jewish history, the 10 Lost Tribes, and just if you're interested in an adventure story or novel. It's fantastic, it's a great translation, and it's a wonderful story that really everyone should read. There's a short introduction here from Professor Verskin, as well as the text. Was out of print for a while, now it's back in print and in English with some light notes. It's really wonderful and a wonderful tale that does have a sad ending. The corporate sponsor of this series is, as always, Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler replacement, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And if you call, please tell them you heard them on the Svarim Chatter podcast. This episode of the series is sponsored by the Virtual Halacha Program. How do you want your Purim to look? Is it really all about finding the best costumes, rushing around making deliveries, and ingesting insane amounts of food and drink? Or do you want your Purim to be different, special, and meaningful? For a limited time, the Virtual Halacha Program is offering a free limmud in hilchos Purim. This is for serious learners who want to see the sugya inside with guidance and clarity. The Virtual Halacha Program, VHP, offers a digital platform that enables learning, which is structured yet flexible for a busy schedule. Click on the link in the show's notes, and for those on the WhatsApp chat or on Twitter, I'll post a flyer where you can see more information. And this is appropriate now that we are in Adar Aleph. You still have some time to Purim, some extra time to learn up on Hilchos Purim. Finally, this episode is also sponsored by Binyamin and Esti Kamenetsky in honor of my grandparents, Shelley and Henry Frisch, and my aunt and uncle, Ellie and Vivi Rosenfeld. Mr. Kamenetsky is a fan of the podcast, and we met a little over a year ago, and we were talking about the Shabtai Tzvi series, which he really enjoyed. And I suggested this, and he said he wanted to sponsor an episode, and I suggested this one. I said this is the most similar to Shabtai Tzvi. So hopefully he enjoys it, and I thank him for the sponsorship. And if anyone wants to sponsor an individual episode of this series or in general on the podcast, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or check the information and links in the show's notes below. You can also subscribe to the Svarim Chatter Substack, which is like a blog. You get emailed directly to you. There's a link in the show's notes for that as well. And also, for those that are interested in writing reviews of Svarim or short essays, or short or long, you can email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. Happy to take submissions for those interested in writing there as well. If you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform, especially Apple. A review and a rating does help, so thank you for those that do that. And enjoy this episode about David Reuveni. As I said, I highly recommend the book, and I don't think I mentioned it, but the book in paperback is $28 on Amazon. I'll put the link. It's not expensive, and very much recommend reading it, and enjoy the discussion here on the podcast and the snippets, really, from the diary that, again, highly recommend that you read. So enjoy this episode of the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness series.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. In this episode of the podcast, we're going to be joined by Professor Alan Verskin, who is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Rhode Island. I will be discussing David Reuveni, and specifically the new translation that Professor Verskin just translated, edited, and published, titled Diary of a Black Jewish Messiah, the 16th Century Journey of David Reuveni through Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, published by Stanford University Press. And we'll be talking about David Reuveni, the Asar Shvatim, the Lost Tribes, and lots of different things. Europe in the 16th century, there's lots of different things in this autobiography. So thank you, Professor Verskin, for joining me.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So my whole academic journey began when I started studying Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed in college. And I was really interested in the whole environment that produced the Guide to the Perplexed. So I started learning more about medieval Muslim Spain and about Jews and Christians and Muslim life within Muslim Spain. I started studying Arabic. And then the inevitable question was, what happened? Why is that environment not there anymore? And I began learning about the Christian conquest of Spain, which gradually forced Muslims and Jews out of the area through a process of expulsion, forced migration, forced conversion, and so on and so forth. And because I had Arabic language skills, I first explored that with regard to Muslims in Spain. So my first book was all about how Muslims adapted to living under Christian rule in Spain after living exclusively under Muslim rule for centuries. And I wrote a book about, really two books about that. And now I'm returning to the same question, this question of what happened to medieval Spain, but looking at it through a Jewish lens, through the eyes of David Reuveni. David Reuveni lives in the immediate aftermath of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. And finding out more about the people that he met, the lives that he touched in the wake of those events.
Yeah, he shows up in really where we see him, I guess, historically, is when he shows up in Venice in the 1520s. Yeah. So, okay. But that I guess explain, but how specifically did you decide I'm going to translate Reuveni's diary, his travelogue, autobiography, whatever, all of the above, well, we can call it. How did you decide you were going to get involved in that specifically?
So I teach a lot in synagogues, Jewish history in synagogues, really anyone who will invite me. And one of the questions that I keep getting is due to the Black Lives Matter movement is what are the relations exactly between Jews and Blacks, historically speaking? So I started reading Jonathan Schorsch's book called Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World. And I saw in a footnote this reference to David Reuveni's diary. And I'd heard of the diary before, but Schorsch has a little note saying many people thought he was Black. And I found that very, very intriguing. So I managed to get the diary. It wasn't so easy because it was during the pandemic and everything was shut down. And I started reading and translating it. I started reading and translating it with my 12-year-old twin daughters, who also really enjoyed it. And I felt that I had to get it out there so people would be able to read it.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll get into, I guess, really, is was he Black or was he not?
Yes.
I mean, yeah, that's something we'll get into right away. I mean, in the title, like I said, Diary of a Black Jewish Messiah. Messiah, did he think he was Messiah? Black, was he Black? We'll get into that. Mm-hmm. I mean, but it's, as you say, your twin daughters enjoyed it. I mean, it's a rollicking tale, I guess. It's really
the great thing is finding out how many other people enjoyed it too. So Max Brott, who was Kafka's executor, the executor of his will, and he was famous for not burning Kafka's works after he died, despite Kafka's orders. But Max Brott wrote a historical novel called Prince Reueveni, all about Reuveni's life. And then I discovered David Bergelson. During the Holocaust, he's writing a play about David Reuveni. He feels that message is important in that context of the Holocaust, in his case, in Soviet Russia. So I've found so many fans along the way of David Reuveni, but no complete translation in English. So I feel that I wanted to share that with more people.
Yeah, and I think even the Hebrew edition of Zev Ascoli, I think Presnay is not around anymore, and the manuscript is also. We can talk all about that, but again, it's a fun book. It reads like fiction. It might be fiction. We can
not completely, but yes.
Correct, and we'll get into that. But it is a lot of fun. I will say that a very enjoyable read for everyone. Will say that right away. It's really just a pleasure to read it. So let's start off all the way over there. Okay, who is David Reuveni? Listeners might be familiar from their own and might be familiar from other episodes of the podcast where this has been touched upon. We've discussed it, but here this episode is just dedicated to him. Who is he? Where is he from? What do we know? And we'll get into more of this in the diary, but kind of with that and other sources, what's his story?
So I think that the story that historians can tell about him begins in 1524. He shows up in Venice, and he says that he is the general of the army of a vast Jewish kingdom, some 300,000 Jews. We're talking a large kingdom. And where is that kingdom located? Just next to Mecca. And he does not claim, at least according to his own accounts, that he's the Messiah, although many Jews believe him to be the Messiah. But he claims to have this ambassadorial role. And he wants to make his way to the Pope. And what does he want to ask the Pope for? He wants to ask the Pope for ships and weapons in exchange for an alliance with his Jewish kingdom in Arabia. And this is a deal that a lot of European rulers think might be good because they need a friendly power in the Red Sea that can help them against the Ottomans. So he's offering something that they might actually want, and he's not asking for that much. The kinds of weapons he asked are not that expensive, so some people are thinking about placing a small bet on him. Should I continue through his journey, or?
You can continue. I just want to jump in. So he says that his brother is King Joseph of the three Shvatim, right?
Yes.
So he says that's what he says, and at this point, was it Reuven God and half of Menashe, right? I think.
Yes.
And then so this is what he tells them. Now, let's just talk about the black part right away. I mean, where do we know? I mean, we have it. I think from Farisol and maybe others describe him. Where do we have the description of him as being black? Where does these descriptions come from?
So we have multiple descriptions of him, both from his friends and from his enemies, some from Jews, some from Christians, and all of them say that he's black. And the question is, what does black mean in this context? And at least two of our sources say that he's black. One says he's black, like the Abyssinians, like the Ethiopians. Those are the words of an Italian diplomat. Who has experience with moving and seeing different kinds of people. We also have another source, a Jewish source, which says he's Shahor Kekushi. And I should emphasize that that's not in the modern Hebrew sense of the term. It probably means black as a Nubian. So we're talking about, again, associating his looks with someone coming from Africa. So I think it's beyond dispute that he was black. He was perceived as black by everyone who saw him.
Now, were there other black Jews that the Jews of Italy who see him were familiar with, or were they not? Do we know that they were familiar with any others?
So they were not familiar with any other black Jews. Black Jews do appear, and if you look at the Cairo Geniza, we have references to black Jews coming from Abyssinia and so on and so forth. So the people are not Jews in the world are not unaware of the possibility of black Jews, and I think what makes it plausible for them is that they've just discovered black Christians. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about this legend of Prester John. So in the early Middle Ages, Christians have this legend that somewhere adjacent to the Muslim world is this really powerful Christian kingdom that is going to help them against the Muslim power, against the Ottomans. And everyone is terrified of the Ottomans in this period. Every Christian is terrified of the Ottomans in this period because the Ottomans are a much stronger power than Christians. So they need all the help they can get. And this Prester John, this Christian king, might be able to help them. Now, where is Prester John's kingdom? There are all kinds of guesses. Some people say it's in India. Some people say it's in Africa. And then the Portuguese begin to explore Africa. They begin to expand their empire, and they go to Abyssinia, and lo and behold, there's a Christian king, and they say the legends are true. We have discovered Prester John, and he's going to help us in our battles against the Muslims in the Red Sea area. And Jews are also influenced by these legends, because if they've discovered an unknown Christian king, where are the tribes located? Maybe in the same place that the Christians discovered this hitherto unknown Christian power. So Jewish legends develop about where are the lost tribes. They're in Africa. They're in battle with this newly discovered Christian ruler. So Jews at this point are imagining that the lost tribes, or many of them, are located in Africa. Probably around Abyssinia.
Okay, yeah, and Prester John, Reueveni does mention Prester John at least once, if not more, in the diary.
Yes.
And I can leave more specifics about Prester John for another episode. But
and Reueveni is aware of all of these legends. That's why he's so persuasive. He speaks to people in their own apocalyptic language. He speaks to people in their own mythical with regard to their own myths. And he says to the Pope, he wants a letter so that he can go and visit Prester John, just as you said there.
Yeah, that's what he says, exactly. So He tells this to the Pope. So a couple more things. Do we know how old Reueveni is when he shows up on the international scene or on the Italian scene in 1524?
We have no clue. We don't. They don't say his age. All that we know about him is that he's very short, that he has a body which is covered in scars, that everyone assumes is because of all of his military work, and that he only speaks Hebrew, which everyone finds very difficult to understand, but he speaks it because that's the official language of his Jewish kingdom in Arabia, and he also speaks Arabic. Now, whether he knew some other languages on the side, he definitely didn't admit to them, but he is such a good reader of the politics of his age, where he's in all of those Christian courts of the royal courts of the period, and he reads them so well, it's hard for me to imagine that he didn't know one of those languages as well. Yeah,
and it seems the Hebrew speaking of the Aseres HaShvatim is the purported language of something that happens with Eldar Hadani in the 9th century, right? A couple centuries before him. So it's the same thing again. Now, you mentioned Arabia there. Where was he from? I know this is a question that scholars still have. Where do we know? I mean, what's your opinion? Where he is from? What are some of the general different opinions, though? Also,
so guesses as to where he is from are all over the map. Some people imagine that he's an Ashkenazi Jew, and they think that he speaks Yiddish. And what is the basis for all of their guesses? Trying to guess his mother tongue by the language that he uses in his diary. And the language in this diary, I can tell you, is absolutely anarchic. It's very easy to understand. It's written in a very make-do kind of Hebrew, but the grammar and the syntax is just not there. And sometimes it involves a certain amount of creative guesswork. So people see traces of Slavic languages. People see traces of Yiddish. There are people who read the diary and see traces of Arabic. There are people who say that there are traces of Romance languages. You name it, people guess it because he's black. Some people say that he's a Jew from Abyssinia. I say, given that uncertainty, and given that he may have had help writing that diary, one of his secretaries may have helped him write it down, we just can't make guesses on that basis. So I think we have to sit back and say we just don't know.
Right. And this is kind of the question. And we're going to talk more about the diary, its language, and who wrote it, and the manuscript. I'll leave that to the end. I want to talk about his story. I think that's more interesting to start off over here. Okay. Just one more thing on the title, because you put it in the title, so we have to discuss it here in the beginning. We discussed the black part, but you also said Black Jewish Messiah. Mm-hmm. Does he view himself as Messiah? I believe at one point he says, I am not the Messiah in the diary. I am a sinner every day or something he says. Is that what he really viewed himself as? Did he view himself as the Messiah? What did others view him as?
So many people believed him to be the Messiah. It's true, absolutely, as you say, that he says he's not the Messiah. But there are a few things that we have to bear in mind. That people who claim to be the Messiah often don't announce their messianic intentions immediately. So with the Messianic claimant we know about best, Shabbatai Tzvi, it isn't for some years into his mission that he's actually proclaimed to be the Messiah. He's talking about Messianic times. He's talking about the imminence of this Messianic period. But that claim about him himself is made later. So it's not that surprising that he's denying that. And I also think that this is not like Monty Python's Life of Brian. People don't just happen to arbitrarily identify someone as the Messiah. He's leading them on in some way. But there's something I think is even more important that Reueveni does, which I think is important for later Messianism. And I think he's taking up something which you see in the Rambam. Now, the Rambam really wants to dampen Messianic enthusiasm in his time. It's becoming very destructive. He writes a letter to the Jews in Yemen who are plagued with a false Messiah, and he wants to make it more difficult for people to claim to be the Messiah. So one of the things, if you look at the Mishneh Torah, what he says that the establishment of the Sanhedrin has to precede the Messiah. That's something that he says. And what's the intention of this? It means that you can't just have a charismatic individual coming up and announcing himself to be Mashiach. You have to have the support of the rabbis in some way. And I think that Rambam's intention in this is to make it more difficult for people to announce that they're Messiah. And those Messiahs are just so destructive when they come in, so destabilizing for Jewish population. So he makes it more difficult. What does Reueveni do? He says, he's really saying to Rambam, challenge accepted. He comes with a Sanhedrin. In his kingdom in Arabia, there's a Sanhedrin, and lo and behold, he has a letter of support from the Sanhedrin of his brother's kingdom in Arabia. So he's talking about the kinds of Reueveni is talking about the kinds of political organization necessary in order to launch oneself as the Messiah. You need a Sanhedrin. You need an army. You need to be an accomplished diplomat. You need to have political contacts, and this is a very influential for the kinds of messianic activity that continue in the 16th century. I'll mention one example, which is in terms of the reintroduction of smicha in Tzfat in the 1530s, where with Yaakov Ber Rav is attempting to reintroduce smicha with the idea that eventually a Sanhedrin is going to be formed, and Yaakov Ber Rav and his circle were very aware of Reueveni. Many of them were from these exact populations in Spain and Portugal, where Reueveni had been active. And here he's doing what Reueveni did. There are other examples too, but I think that Reueveni is quintessentially a messianic figure. And he was embraced as that. And I don't think we have to take too seriously the fact that he's officially denying that he's the Messiah. I think the contrast that shows how genuine he is. Only a true Messiah would deny, at least initially, that he's the Messiah.
Okay, so let's start off. Let's discuss the diary. So first of all, in the book, I'll just say there's the maps, as you say, the world of David Reuveni.
Yes.
And then there is an introduction. 20 or so pages. Now, it starts off in Africa. He gives us, so let's talk about it. He's in Africa. He says, what's he doing there? What does he say? He's kind of he's disguised as a Muslim for some reason. Yes. Or again, actually, before we jump into this, you know what? Okay. I'm going to take another track. I'm going to get back to this question in a second. But the accuracy of this, I said before, it reads like fiction in places. Because as we have discussed right at the beginning, how accurate is this thing or not? Obviously, it's somebody's own text or that he wrote. So, and we can talk more about that later. Did he really write it, or you mentioned those? But how accurate is this, and how much can we say, oh, this is made up, this is not accurate, this is kind of fiction?
So, I think the first thing about the African section is that it serves his larger purpose, that a Messiah is supposed to draw in all the Jews from all the corners of the world to which they've been dispersed. So, of course, he has to be in Africa. He's showing his credibility that way. He meets with members of the lost tribes who are located in Africa. Yes, some of them are located with him in Arabia, but some are also in Africa. So it serves his purpose really well. How do we know whether he went there? Unlike the European sections of the diary, which are corroborated with external sources. So, Reueveni says he went to the Pope, and we have papal documents saying that he went to the Pope. We don't have corroborating evidence of him in Africa, and we actually have very little written evidence for this particular region of Africa in this period. So it's not surprising that we don't have that evidence. People look at the list of places that he visited, and some people say that this is knowledge that he couldn't have culled from existing works of geography, that he must have been there or been in contact with someone who was there. There are a number of historians who take that position. But there's also a sense with this African section that he's trying to please a European audience that wants these exotic tales of Africa, and you see that there. They want to see cannibals, so he gives you cannibals, right?
Yeah, that's what I say. He throws in the cannibals. He throws in these exotic elements, and he's running around. He's disguised. Why is he this? Okay, so you discussed the accuracy. I don't want to get off on that. I just wanted to address that up front, that there are definitely parts, and we can discuss that throughout as we go through the sections. There are parts that are verifiable from outside sources that we know these things happened, or he's describing a place. We know that description is accurate. So whether some of it is made up, of course, could be, but some of it we know for sure. Okay, so he's in Africa. He's discussing the where he says the tribes. I want to say parts of it where I'll just say the cannibalism. They eat elephants, wolves, leopards, dogs, camels, scorpions, frogs, and snakes. Also eat human flesh, and this other kind of exotic descriptions. What you would imagine somebody would envision such tribes. He goes through. He's
trying to please his readers like a lot of travel writers. The second question you mentioned is why is he dressed as a Muslim? I think one of the interesting things about this diary is Reueveni never tells us why he does things. He just tells us what he does in a very mundane way. He even gives us his expenses. But why is he dressed as a Muslim? My view is that the fundamental part of his mission involves negotiating with non-Jewish rulers, with Christian rulers, with Muslim rulers. And I think that he thinks that in the Muslim world, his best shot at getting access to those people in power is by being a Muslim. So that's why he's dressed as a Muslim there. In the Christian world, he reads the political situation differently, and he thinks that he can do better as a Jewish ally of those Christian kingdoms. There's another part to this too, that after Africa, still dressed as a Muslim, he goes to Egypt and to the Holy Land. And there he wants to go into Dome of the Rock. He wants to see Har HaBayit, right? And the best way to get access to those places is to be dressed as a Muslim. It would be much more difficult for a Jew in that time to do that. So I think there's a practical aspect to it as well.
So is he undoubtedly a Jew then? I mean, it's interesting just because I asked that, just because he portrays himself as a Muslim, and this is how he says. Then I guess what we know of him historically from other outsources, he definitely was Jewish. We're just asking based on how he describes himself.
So we know nothing about him, but I feel that someone who is, who speaks Hebrew, however well he speaks it, is so imbued with Jewish culture, is unlikely to be a non-Jew in this period.
Okay, now he goes to Egypt, or again, purportedly, we'll say, and he gives this description where he's swindled out of a lot of money, as he says. Now, you could say the story about what happens here, but this is something that either it happened or it didn't happen, but why is the ambassador, the general of these armies, showing up as a pauper? So he obviously has to give over this kind of story, otherwise it doesn't make any sense.
I think, yes, you're absolutely right, that this is forming an alibi. That if you're going to show up in Venice, and we have descriptions of all of the ambassadors who show up in Venice, your credibility or your riches. That they're giving expensive gifts, they've got a whole entourage, they've got servants, they're impressive. That's what allows them to enter into these kinds of diplomatic negotiations. And he's showing up with nothing. So he has to explain why he has come with how despite being from this rich Jewish kingdom, he's come with nothing. And he also has to demonstrate his credibility. And he does that by being extremely pious. Now, in the book, you'll hear a lot about the wild parties that seem to go on at his house and the lavish gifts he gives people. But he is always fasting. He is always praying. He is living this life of an ascetic. His piety is the witness to his credibility, because he doesn't have the wealth to do what other ambassadors are doing.
Okay. So, I mean, and there's a story where he has this rich Egyptian who steals all his money, he says.
Yeah.
And the guy leaves the chest of jewels, diamonds, whatever's in it, and then he comes back, it's gone. He says, look, he stole everything from me. He's a crook. And that's kind of how he says it. So he ends up, he goes to Eretz Yisrael, as you mentioned. Interestingly, he goes to Maras Machpelah, and he says, he gives a whole very interesting depiction over there.
So that to me looks genuine. And that's we don't have any outside sources corroborating his visit anywhere other than to Europe. But his description of Marat Machpelah looks very genuine. I mean, it's the way people describe that building.
Yeah, he kind of goes through that, and he goes, as you mentioned already, he goes to Yerushalayim. He says, as I'll read some of the subheaders here in the chapters as you put him in a sign at the temple in Jerusalem. So he goes over there, says he gets a sign. And is that a messianic thing that he talks about? If you want to mention that he says he gets a sign there.
So absolutely. I don't think that sign is required of other messiahs, but that's part of his credibility, right? That he's receiving this divine guidance there.
Yeah. Okay. So then he ends up. Okay, he goes back, he travels to Alexandria, he goes to Venice, he ends up in Italy. Let's talk about Italy. That's where we know of him from outside sources. He shows up in Venice, we already said his description. What happens in Venice? When does he get to the Pope? What goes on in Italy?
Okay. So his main purpose is to get to the Pope. And we're looking at a situation in which, if you were a betting man in the 16th century, you would bet on a Muslim victory, an Ottoman victory over Christians. And both the Christian and the Muslim side are primed for war. And people think that this great confrontation between Muslims and Christians is going to happen. And it's a time of, epoch-changing events. There's been the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, 1492. Spain is purged of Christianity and of Judaism and Islam. People think that they're in apocalyptic times and a conflict is coming, and Christians are looking for allies. So. Part of the way I explained Reuveni's appeal, I think, can be illustrated by looking into the Christopher Columbus story. How does Christopher Columbus justify his voyage to Ferdinand and Isabella? He is looking for the Grand Khan, who is this ruler who is not Christian, but is friendly to Christians and doesn't like Muslims, who can ally himself with the Christians and assure their victory over Muslims. That's how Christopher Columbus justifies his trip. And here Reuveni shows up and he says, you guys got the basic idea of the Grand Khan right, except this Grand Khan is Jewish. That this mysterious non-Christian helper is actually a Jew in Arabia. So it's within the realm of possibility for a lot of for these Christian courts, for the Pope, for example. Go ahead.
No, keep going. And he gets to the Pope. So yeah.
Yeah. So he's so the Pope is prepared in that way for a figure like Reuveni. Other things have happened too. Cortez has got back from Mexico, where he has just discovered the so-called barbaric Aztec culture. But the Aztecs are sophisticated. They're not like the other barbarians that Christians have seen. They've built these amazing cities. They have sophisticated armies. And so the idea that Reuveni has this army of Jewish barbarians in Arabia who are sophisticated and militarily strong is not insane. And it's a realm that sounds crazy to us, that there would be this massive Jewish kingdom next to Mecca. But this is an era in which all kinds of geographical truths are being overturned. people did not imagine the existence of an extra continent, of the New World, and they've just discovered that exists. So Reueveni is playing on all of these kinds of geographical uncertainties and wishes and hopes of all of these Christians in the courts of Europe. And he goes to the Pope. And how do you get an audience with the Pope? It's very, very difficult. But he finds a way. There's this cardinal called Egidio di Viterbo. And Egidio di Viterbo is what we would call a Christian Hebraist. He doesn't like the Jews, but he thinks that the Kabbalah is a repository of truth, and he wants to get that truth from its impious Jewish guardians. So he's hired rabbis to teach him Hebrew, to teach him the Kabbalah, and Reueveni comes along. And Reueveni seems to offer to Egidio this pathway, this opportunity to play a part in the end of the world, in these apocalyptic events. So he speaks to Egidio di Viterbo, who is very impressed by him. Maybe he even understands some of Reuveni's Hebrew. He'd studied Hebrew for a long time before he met Reueveni, and that's what gives Reueveni the audience with the Pope. So he meets the Pope. And Reueveni showers the Pope with praise. He says, and this is this very weird phrase, he says to the Pope, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." I don't know whether you noticed that phrase, but he's taking it right out of the passage with Yaakov and Esav. He says, "Al ken ra'iti panecha kirot panei Elohim vatirtzeni." So Yaakov is about to meet Esav. He's worried that Esav is going to overwhelm him. So he has all of these strategies to bring his family gradually in front of Esav. And he says to Esav, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." So it's a very backhanded comment. It's exactly the kind of the comment that Yaakov gives Esav. So we know where Reueveni is standing. And the Pope is flattered by Reueveni, but in the end, he says he sort of believes his story, he sort of doesn't believe his story, and he gives him a letter of recommendation to go to the King of Portugal. And the King of Portugal, Portugal at the time is this massive naval power, one of the greatest Christian naval powers of the period. And he says to Reueveni, "This King of Portugal is going to be able to help you out better than I can." So the visit is a failure, but he does leave with these letters of support from the Pope.
Okay, so first of all, Cardinal Egidio di Viterbo, I think Leo Bacher was the one.
Yes.
Elijah Levita, he was the one who taught him. Now, also in Rome at this time is the Sforno, Ravaggio Sforno, famous commentator, and he gets thrown in jail, I believe, right? Because of Reueveni. Reueveni thinks that they're out to get him, and he gets him to be thrown in jail, I think. I actually think, I don't remember if it was on the podcast, I think that I had a while ago. Listeners may remember, I interviewed Moshe Kravis, who's done a lot of work on Sforno, and he says there's an allusion to Reueveni in Sforno's commentary, somewhere in Nach, I'm not remembering, where he doesn't say him by name, but there is an allusion to him and this this incident. I can find that exactly. I think we was on that podcast episode. But anyway.
So the one thing I should say is that Reueveni says Ovadia Sforno was thrown in jail. We don't have evidence, unfortunately, from other sources. I searched quite hard for that and couldn't find it, which doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that we only have Reuveni's word for it.
Okay, I don't recall. I can ask Kravitz what exactly happened there. Now, that being said, what were the Jews, the general Jews, and Ravaggio Sforno, the Rabbanim, the rabbis, what were their opinion of Reueveni? He shows up in Venice, he's in Rome, he's going through Italy, Italian Jewish communities. What is their impression of him?
So that's an interesting question. So first of all, there are all kinds of rabbis who are writing about what's going to happen in Messianic end times. And we look at Abarvanel, and Abarvanel is talking about the times of the Mashiach are going to be precipitated by this huge conflict between Christians and Muslims. And there are all kinds of Kabbalists like Yochanan Alamano, and they're going through all of these geographical works for hints as to how these battles are exactly going to happen. And among the most important information is where these lost tribes are located. So there's this atmosphere where people are actively trying to predict the end of days, given what they know of the politics of the period and given what they know of the geography. And Avraham ben Eliezer Halevi writes about how this last battle is going to be in Jeddah. And what's going to happen? The Muslims are going to lure the Portuguese into Jeddah, where they think they're going to be able to go from there to conquering Mecca, and the whole Christian force is going to be slaughtered. And why is it going to happen there? Because Jeddah, says Halevi, is in fact from the word God. So these are people who affiliate themselves with the tribe of God. And Reueveni, I think, seems to be familiar with all of these kinds of legends. When he asks for weapons, he asks for them to be sent to this port of Jeddah. And what exactly is his plan? It seems like it's a Halevi type plan, where Avraham ben Eliezer Halevi type plan, where it's going to involve a battle between Muslims and Christians, and Muslims are probably going to win. So that's the story that Reueveni tells, and people have been hearing various versions of that story, whether they're reading Abarvanel or whether they're reading Alamano or somewhere else, and they, at least some of them, seem to accept his message.
Okay, so Abarbanel is his trilogy. He has Mayania, Yeshua, Yeshua's Mashiach.
Yeah,
and I'm forgetting the last one.
Yeshua Mashiach is exactly where he talks about the Ottoman ruler. He actually calls him Mashiach, right? In some sense.
Yeah, so that's that. Or Yochanan Romano, as you mentioned, famous Kabbalist Makubal in Italy at the time. Okay, so Jeddah is a city, a port city in Saudi Arabia near Mecca, and that's
today.
Yeah, and that's where he wants to get these weapons for his army to go fight. Okay, so now first of all, I don't know if you mentioned, so he has specific supporters for sure. Does Reueveni, the Dapisa family, Daniel Dapisa? I mean, there's a couple other famous ones. So they're supporting him monetarily. What happens there?
Yes, so. The main family is this Dapisa family, and they're a family of bankers. They're the super wealthy elite of the period. They've already, when Reueveni meets them, have devoted a huge amount of their income to helping all of these Jews from Spain and Portugal who are trying to find homes after having been expelled. And I think Reuveni's story is really important for understanding the history of the period. We have this view of Sephardic Jews. They're driven out of Spain, and suddenly they go to the Ottoman Empire, and they have a beautiful Sephardic civilization. That is true. The end of the story is happy, but in this early period in the 16th century, it is not at all clear that things are going to work out that way. There are all kinds of powers hinting at further expulsions of the Jews from Italy, from Europe, from elsewhere. And the people who are interested in Reuveni's solution are worried about those kinds of uncertainties, and the Dapisas are among them. So the Dapisas are wealthy. Daniel Dapisa, his first major supporter, is the de facto head of the Jews of Rome. He negotiates with the Pope on behalf of the Jews. He's this kind of Stadlan. He authors these takanot for the city of Rome to kind of create this balance between the older Italian Jewish families and the newer families that have moved to Rome. This is a major Jewish political figure. They're also immensely learned. So Daniel Dapisa is learned, but even more so is his cousin Yechiel, who we meet later in the diary, who actually retires from his life as a banker and devotes himself to the study of the Kabbalah. And I don't know, maybe I can just briefly say things about his books. He has a book called, I think, Chaye Olam, which is about banking, about taking interest in this period, something as a banker he knows a lot about. And he also writes some Kabbalistic works. He writes Minchat Knaot, which is this. The Rashba wrote a work banning people from studying philosophy and natural sciences before the age of 25, and that was refuted by Yedaya Bedersi, and Yechiel de Pisa writes a work coming in on the side of Rashba, coming in on the side of that skepticism towards Aristotelian philosophy. So these are very learned Jews who are also wealthy, well-placed, and politically savvy.
Okay. As well as there's a lot of, again, it's a fun read. If we should read the diary, I think it's a really, really good read. But he talks about his illness, he's in someone's house, he moves from one house to the next house, he has a new residence, he has an old one, and he goes through a lot of details. And then he gets up to, he mentions Daniel de Pisa, he gets to meet with the Pope, he has one meeting with the Pope, 2 meetings with the Popes. And then he mentions those who are against him, like we already mentioned, going to jail, getting the Rabbanim into jail in Rome. There's a couple of other things going on at this time. Just interestingly, before we go a little more, what was Reuveni's opinion of Italian Jewry? What was his opinion of them?
So he was very impressed, and he contrasts them with the Jews of the Muslim world, and he says that the Jews of the Muslim world are weak and completely unfit to serve in an army. But the Italian Jews are valiant and have those skills, and they can be his fighting force. Now, why does he come to this positive assessment of Italian Jews and negative assessment of Jews of the Muslim world? Especially as I think he has more of an insight into the Jews of the Muslim world just by virtue of speaking Arabic. I think that things are relatively stable for Ottoman Jews in this period. That when he goes to Egypt, the Jews there don't give him the time of day. They see him as a troublemaker. They want to see him leave as soon as possible. They don't even offer him hospitality for the most part. A little bit when he gets to the Holy Land. But in Italy, these Jews are seeing the exiles from Spain and Portugal firsthand. Charles V has a great reputation with the Jews in the end. People see him as a great savior of the Jews. But in these early years, in the 1520s and 1530s, he's contemplating a whole range of the possibility of expelling Jews from all of his realms. And he is the ruler of the largest empire that's been in the world for centuries. So Jews are terrified. And they're willing to look to riskier solutions like the ones that David Reuveni is offering. So I think that's the reason for his disparity. More satisfied, more stable Jews of the Muslim world, less Jews living in a less politically stable environment in the Christian world.
Now, as we already mentioned, Reuveni decides he's going to Portugal. He gets a letter from the Pope to the King of Portugal. But at this time, we encounter, I guess, in the diary, his arch nemesis, Dom Miguel. So what happens with him? And Reuveni doesn't have very nice things to say about him.
Yes. So there's this statesman, Don Miguel, and he is when Reuveni first meets him, he is the Portuguese king's ambassador to Rome. He's also a bishop. And I think Don Miguel sees right through Reuveni. He thinks that he's a fraud. He advises the Portuguese king to send him on his way as fast as possible. He sees that Reuveni is revered as this kind of messianic figure by all the conversos. These Jews have recently been forcibly converted to Christianity. He thinks that Reuveni is going to endanger their what he sees as their fragile Christianity, and he wants Reuveni out. Now, Reuveni views Don Miguel as an incredibly evil figure, but from all the other sources that we have about Don Miguel, he's he's known as a Machiavellian statesman. That he will, some people even think that Machiavelli drew inspiration from him or from people very like him. And he's serving the king, and that means that he's against Reueveni. But later in life, when his relations with the king of Portugal break down and he's exiled and he has to return back to Rome, he ends up advocating for conversos in Rome. So he's very much on their side towards the end of his life.
Yeah, so you mentioned Machiavelli, Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine statesman from Florence, at this time period, really.
Yes.
Okay, so, but he really meets Don Miguel in Italy, and there's a lot related to the book. He gets stuck. He's stuck here. He's stuck there. Everything starts schlepping around, and he's kind of relaying all these details. Some more interesting than others. Yep. People that are interested in him. He starts mentioning his servants. I want to talk a little bit about the servants. Actually, I was going to say this later. But now, a lot of throughout the book, you translate a lot of it's like servants, but. I mean, what was the Hebrew translation? And is servants kind of accurate, or is it more like, were they like his helpers, his employees? What do you mean by servant, slave? Could you kind of, I guess, talk about the translation aspect of that here and what that meant that he had these servants?
So I think before I even get down to the nitty-gritty of the translation, I'm going to say that if you read this book, you're going to hear about a lot of problems that Reueveni has with his servants. That takes up a huge amount of the book, and the question is why, right? And why does this guy feel that this is worthy, or why does Reueveni think that this is worthy of record? And I think this is what makes the diary in many ways so special. It's a how-to guide for prospective messiahs. That if you're a prospective messiah and you need to get your team together, I think one of the paradoxes of messianism is that although you need to be very organized, it's an inherently destabilizing activity. And the kinds of people who are going to join a prospective messiah are going to be people on the very periphery of society with nothing to lose or with very little to lose. So in Reuveni's time, Jews are banned from being in Portugal. So the kind of Jew who would sign on to go to Portugal under conditions where Judaism is banned in Portugal is going to be a very unique kind of person. And you're going to get criminals, you're going to get borderline criminals, you're going to get people who are, out of luck, and you're going to have to make do with the people that you've got. And that's what Reuveni's message is there. He's making do with his team. He knows the problems of his team. And he's saying to future people who are going to engage in this kind of work, that's what you're going to have to do. He also lists all of these expenses so that, future people engaged in this kind of activity in the future are going to know what kind of budget they need, right? It's a very practical guide. But in terms of servants, some of them are absolutely servants. So we have this passage in the diary where where Reuveni's servants are asking for his permission to leave his service. They want to go back, and he says, "You can leave, but I'm not going to give you my permission." So what's all that about? There were laws to protect employers in Italy. That if you had a servant who signed on for a year of service and wanted to end early, he needed a letter from his employer. Otherwise, the next employer would pay a very heavy fine. So these were employer protection laws. Not very good for the servants, but good for the employers. So when Reuveni is taught, it's a kind of indentured servitude almost, although these people are getting salaries. Now, those are clear servants. They're getting paid. Reuveni talks about how they're paid by Daniel de Pisa and so on and so forth. There are servants, when he still uses the word misharet in Hebrew, who seem to be more on a volunteer basis. Now, he uses the exact same word, misharet, and so I translated both as misharet, but you can see that he's using the word with a slightly different nuance. There are also slaves in this book, and to describe a slave, he uses the word eved. Occasionally for female slaves, he'll use, shifcha or something like that, but those are slaves, and he will never call a slave a misharet. He distinguishes between those terms, but he does have people who seem to be more volunteers, more part of an entourage, but he uses the same word. So I was stuck with that as a translator, and I left it that way.
Okay, just wanted to point that out in the translation once we're hearing the story. So as you say, there are many instances of fighting and bickering and major issues that he has from his servants. It causes him a lot of sorrows really throughout. We can get involved a little bit more. So he comes to Portugal. And as you mentioned, Portugal is this massive power at the time. And he comes there to King João III, John III, we'll say call him John. He, how does he get to the king? And what is he, he's trying to convince the king to give him these weapons, as we said, right?
Yeah. So what does he come with? The whole business is coming to people for him, is coming to people with the right letters. And he has his letter from his brother, who's the king of Arabia. And when he comes to Portugal, he's got a letter from the Pope. And we can actually read the letter from the Pope. It's preserved in the Vatican archives. And what does it say? It says, the Pope says, this is the story that Reueveni tells, that he's from this Jewish kingdom that doesn't like its Muslim neighbors, and he's prepared to ally himself with Christians. And sometimes the Pope says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and sometimes we can be helped by Jews who are our enemies. So the Pope it's faint praise for Reueveni in this letter. And he also says, I can't verify his story, but it seems plausible. He says, he says to the King of Portugal, you'll be able to better verify Reuveni's story. So that's how he gets access to the King of Portugal. Why does the King of Portugal want help from Reueveni? Because the big issue at the time is the Red Sea, that they want control over the Red Sea, and the Ottomans have effective control over it. So the whole business with Prester John, with the Portuguese trying to find an alliance with the king of Abyssinia, is about control of the Red Sea, because Abyssinia has access to the Red Sea, and the Portuguese, who are this massive naval power, think that they can get control over the Syria. Now, why do they want control? For some concrete reasons, that it makes trade with the eastern parts of their empire very much easier. The Portuguese have colonies in India, and being able to ship items from India back to Portugal through the Red Sea area would be very convenient for them. They also have apocalyptic reasons for doing it, that we have all of these apocalyptic texts which describe how in the end times, the Christian ruler, the King of Portugal, will be able to conquer Mecca. And if you're going to conquer Mecca, getting to Mecca through the Red Sea is very very helpful. So that's the carrot for the Reuveni's carrot for the King of Portugal. Eventually, the King of Portugal thinks it's not worth it. I don't know whether I should get to that point yet. How he gets chased out of Portugal.
Yeah, we'll get there in a minute. I just want to say, the Don Miguel shows up again, and he tells them don't pay attention, and then he speaks to an interpreter in Arabic, not in Hebrew. And then it's actually he says, when he began speaking Arabic, I told the king in the holy tongue, I do not want to speak with this Ishmaelite, because Ishmaelites are my enemy, because of She'elim. I can tell from the way this official speaks that he is mother and father Ishmaelites. And then he says, my father and my mother and I are Christians, not Ishmaelites. Said he was greatly afraid and trembled before the king. And then Don Miguel spoke out against him. It's like back and forth. And he's like, no. And it's great. He said he rejoiced. The king said he liked me. It's like a really interesting, intriguing back and forth. It's really just to throw it out there. So, yeah, first of all, a couple of things happen. There's Reuveni's trouble. He has that his slaves, again, are running around. They're selling their clothing. They're fighting in the streets. And then they bring in a maidservant. And there's kind of issues there with one of the slaves and her, and there's all sorts of it's all, he relates everything in here. There's all sorts of things going on with the slaves. So he has real problems from the slaves, and then he has the problem from the conversos, the crypto Jews, Moranos. He has an issue with them. And Shlomo Molcho, listeners may be familiar. If not, I can listen to my podcast episode with Mati Ben Melech about Molcho. But Shlomo Molcho comes into the story. So I'll give it to you to talk about all that.
Great. So he goes to Portugal. As you said, he has really colorful problems with all of his servants, and that's part of the messianic mission, that you're going to have to deal with these unreliable people because you have no alternatives. He also is dealing with a whole bunch of Moroccan Jews. Now, this may sound strange because what are Moroccan Jews doing in Portugal? They shouldn't be there. Judaism is illegal. Well, Portugal has all of these colonies on the North African coast, and those colonies depend on on Moroccan Jews who allow the Portuguese to negotiate with native populations. So some of those Jews have to go on diplomatic missions back to Portugal, and there they meet Reueveni. And they also cause various difficulties for Reueveni. And finally, there's this converso, this son of Christians, of Jews forcibly converted to Christianity, named Diogo Pires. And Diogo Pires is very influenced by Reueveni, and he has a dream which he thinks is urging him to convert to Judaism, to circumcise himself. And he goes to Reueveni and he says, "Circumcise me." And we have this account, a very similar account from Diogo Pires, who changes his name to Shlomo Molcho. We have the same account from Reueveni, so we assume that a very similar account from Reueveni, so we assume that it happened. And Reueveni says, "Not on my watch. If you convert, you're an employee of the king. You're in fact on the Supreme Court." He doesn't say that, but that's what Shlomo Molcho is. And he says, "It'll bring my diplomatic mission to an end. I can't be seen as converting the conversos back to Judaism." And so he tells Molcho to go as far as he can from Portugal and do whatever he has to do there. But nonetheless, the instant Molcho circumcises himself, he flees Portugal, and everyone blames Reueveni for this series of events. And it's one of the major factors which led to Reueveni being driven out of Portugal.
Yeah, and this is part of what Don Miguel is telling the king. He's saying, listen, he's converting these conversos back to Judaism. And then this happens to Shlomo Molcho, and he says, you see, it's exactly what happened. I mean, was Reueveni actually going and talking to other conversos? Was he trying to get them to come back to Judaism, or we just don't know?
So his descriptions of Portugal seem to indicate that was the case. He seems to have turned his house, his diplomatic residence, into a kind of a synagogue. That we see all of these conversos coming to him, kissing his hand. There are allegations that he's reading Jewish books with them, whether he is or he isn't. And people are seeing how, for at least some conversos, not all, for at least some conversos, their attachment to Christianity is very, very superficial, right? And Reueveni is bringing that out, letting the public see that.
Okay, now at this point he's in Portugal. I want to make sure I emphasize, bring out this story. It's on page 101 in the book, where he talks about he gets an emissary from the Muslim lands, contact him, and they ask him about his land. And he gives a description of his land and he talks about the Aseres HaShvatim. It's really interesting. I want to say, he says, as you already mentioned, 300,000 Jews flourish under the role of his brother, King Joseph. He has 70 elders, Shivim Zakanim, and officials. He's the commander of the army. And he explains the whole thing, that they want to go conquer Yerushalayim. And he says how they're in the desert, and the troops, Reuven, Gad, Mechatzev, and Menashe. And he talks about the land of Cush. There are 9.5 tribes also ruled by kings. The 2 tribes that dwell close to us are Shimon and Binyamin. He says they live on the Nile. I mean, if you want to talk about more of this, he goes through, he starts giving a lot of names, and he goes through a lot of it. It's very interesting how he really kind of, this is where he kind of talks about them, because I think this is the description that he gives in the diary, right?
Yes. So I think that's why he's so persuasive to Jews, that he is drawing on existing discussions of the lost tribes, and he knows exactly what to say to a Jewish audience, and I think that Reueveni presents himself as this lost tribesman who is a warrior, who is black, who is strong, who could conceivably fight in those end of time battles, and he's got these kinds of details to prove it. So I think that's really at the core of why he gets the Jewish supporters that he gets.
Now, first of all, here they told him the Jews of Fez and its environs, and even the Ishmaelites, say you are the prophet or the Messiah. And he says, He says, but God forbid, I am a greater sinner before God than any one of them who killed many people. In a single day, I once killed 40 enemies. He says, I'm not a sage or a Kabbalist, neither am I a prophet nor the son of a prophet. I'm merely an army commander. Now, this is interesting. Then he says, I am the son of King Solomon of the line of David, son of Jesse. So, David ben Yishai, which is not from the Seres Shvatim. And my brother is King Joseph, rules over 300,000 people of Habar. So why is he claiming that he's from the Davidic line, from David HaMelech? Is that because that's what it has to be Mashiach? Why is he, even though it should be Seres Shvatim, right?
So I think what he's doing is that you have, especially he's talking a lot to conversos, and conversos are an interesting population. There are some of them who convert to Christianity and they're good Christians. You know, they're faithful to their new religion, and there are some who observe Judaism in secret, and then there are also conversos who have hybrids, and what you're seeing is a response to trauma. That these are especially in Portugal, that in 1497 they forcibly converted the entire Portuguese Jewish community, and different Jews related to that trauma and this kind of new world in different ways. But I think that it's also reflected in the fact that they're willing to entertain vastly different versions of what Mashiach is supposed to do. Now, many of them are highly messianic. I think everyone is messianic, Jews and non-Jews in this period. But bear in mind what's happened to them. They've been forcibly converted to Christianity, which is a religion which focuses a lot on the Messiah. So it's natural that conversos want to figure out, those who are interested in Judaism among them want to figure out what the Jewish attitude to the Messiah is. And secondly, one thing that Christianity does in this period is what is a witness to its truth? The fact that it's powerful. What is a witness to the fact that Jews are wrong? The fact that they're powerless. So when Reueveni is out there and showing that there's a possibility for Jewish power, that there's a possibility that Judaism can be correct and can gain the upper hand, that's very, very persuasive. And I think that he's just playing into those different scenarios. He's by being vague, he's allowing different people to project whatever they want onto his, whatever messianic scenarios in their mind they have, onto his mission.
Right. One more interesting thing about this, he also describes a little further on that 9.5 other tribes live in the land of the blacks in 4 regions of Cush. The tribe of Moses, or the Bnei Moshe, lives in a different area beyond the Sabbatean River. So there's a lot of different, when you read a lot of the stuff at Seres Shvatim, you see different ways, different things. So he's going with that they live here, but the Bnei Moshe are the ones on the other side of the Sabbatean. That's how he's portraying things.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot going on. There's the king, and there's back and forth, the king, Don Miguel. But anyway, let's jump ahead. There's again, a lot of description for those that read it, right? You can read the diary and see all that's going on, the back and forth. A lot happens in Portugal. But with Molcho and the conversos, you mentioned what happens. What's the end of Portugal? And he kind of gets kicked out of Portugal.
So the end is that the king gets very angry, and he thinks that he's returning conversos to Judaism, and he ends diplomatic relations. And Reueveni doesn't get his ships, and he has to make his way out of Portugal. Now he's very fortunate that he does leave with a letter from the king. It's not the letter he hoped for, but at least he can get out of the country safely. He leaves, and then he is driven into Spain. And Spain at that time is under the rule of Charles V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor. And I mentioned this before. This is the largest empire that's existed for centuries. The line about this empire is it's the empire upon which the sun never sets, because Charles V has territories both in the New World and in the Old World. So the sun's always shining somewhere in his empire. And of course, in Spain, Judaism has been banned since 1492. Reueveni turns up and he's immediately arrested. And He is eventually set free once with the specific permission of Charles V. He's captured again, then he's released, and that's where the diary ends.
Okay, and at the end of the diary, there is kind of an addendum, an appendix by Solomon Cohen, who's his friend. So what is this about? How did this get here? What is this?
Okay, so Reueveni shows up in just to get the sequence. He shows up in Venice in 1524. He stays there a year. He leaves for Portugal. He's there for about a year, from about 1525, then he's driven out of there. And then we don't hear anything really about Reueveni from 1527, really almost about to 1530. And the question is what is he doing? Now, I'll tell you what I think he's doing. His main supporters are people in Rome: Egidio di Viterbo, Daniel de Pisa, the Pope. And in 1527, Charles V's mutinous troops sack Rome. And this has disastrous consequences for everyone in Rome. Egidio di Viterbo's library is destroyed. His house is destroyed. He leaves the city. The Pope himself has to leave the city for a year. It's in such bad repair. And the Jewish community is massacred. And we have accounts that before it was this vibrant Jewish community, it's hard even to get a minyan as a result. And so none of his supporters can support him. And perhaps most tragically, Daniel de Pisa, the de facto head of the Jews of Rome and his main supporter, dies in that sack of Rome. So he loses all the power that he has. And where is he? Well, this is the story that he tells, that somehow he's in a ship which gets shipwrecked off the coast of France, and he gets arrested by the Lord of Clermont. We're not quite sure who this individual is, although I speculate as to who he might be. And Reueveni remains imprisoned for 2 years until he's ransomed by the Jews of Avignon and Carpentras at considerable expense. And everything that he has, including his letters from his brother, are confiscated, and he never gets them back.
Is that when he forges some letters, though, then?
So this is the disastrous thing that happens after the diary. So I mentioned before that how does Reueveni get his audiences? It's with letters of recommendation from highly placed people. And he's without his letter from his brother, signed by the 70 members of the Sanhedrin of Arabia. And he's a good Maimonidean messiah. He has a Sanhedrin to support him before he goes into his activities. So without that letter, he loses his raison d'etre. So he goes to some Jews in Mantua and he wants another letter forged. And here he gets sloppy. And he wants 70 signatures. He wants 70 signatures on his new forged letter from his brother in Arabia. So he tries to recruit Jews to sign that letter. And his prestige at this point, it's the early 1530s, isn't what it was. And he gets maybe 20 Jews to do it. And a lot of them are kids. And then he can't get enough. So he feels he has to erase the signatures, but the scribe won't rewrite the document. And the rabbis of Mantua begin to get worried. They think that this is going to bring trouble to the Jews. So they denounce him to the Marquis of Mantua. And the Marquis decides not to immediately prosecute Reueveni, but he sends he clearly marks this document that Reueveni has made as a forgery. He gets the person who created it to hide something under the seal, and he sends Reueveni back to Rome with this clearly forged document, and that's when Reuveni's fortune begins to turn. I think that the other thing that happens in Mantua is that we have the first rabbinical letter against Reueveni. And this is by a rabbi called Azriel ben Shlomo Diana, who was a very eminent rabbi. We have 2 volumes of shutim of his. And he describes this environment where Reueveni is going from town to town and is using each Jewish community as his personal piggy bank. And he says, we've got to stop. This guy's a fraud, and Jews should not pay any attention to him. So this is the beginning of the turning of the tide against Reueveni, both among Christians and among Jews.
Yeah, but Joel, we have those 2 volumes, Shalos Teshuvos, that were published, 30, 40 years ago. They published a manuscript. I don't think they're really around anymore. I think it was Tel Aviv University Press.
Could be.
So what happens to Reueveni at the end of his life? Where does he end up? What happens?
So he goes back to Venice, and he meets up with Shlomo Molcho. And Shlomo Molcho at this point has an immense following. The Shlomo Molcho's life has been traced very nicely in a biography by Moti ben Melech. And Reueveni, together with Molcho, who he initially rejected back in Portugal, go to meet Charles V in Regensburg. And on the way, they seem to have passed through France, met the French king, although nothing seems to have come of it. And he goes to the court of Charles V, and one person at that court is the great Stadtland, Yossel of Rosheim. And Yossel of Rosheim has these detailed, it's almost like a diary or a historical record of events, and he's terrified because Yossel of Rosheim has, Charles V has previously wanted to expel Jews, and one of his reasons for expelling them is that he thinks the Jews are loyal to the Ottomans, not to the Christians. And here's Reueveni and Molcho with their plans to foment war between Muslims and Christians, and he thinks things will work out really badly for all the Jews of the town. So he says that in order to dissociate the Jews from Reueveni and Molcho, he actually leaves the town entirely when they arrive. And Charles V meets with them and decides that that it's a fraud or it's not worth pursuing, and he hands them over to the Inquisition. And at that point, they get separated. I won't follow Molcho's trajectory because this is about Reueveni, but Reueveni gets prosecuted by the Inquisition. And on the one hand, this is very interesting because the Inquisition is supposed to only prosecute Christians. So they're accusing Jews who have been converted to Christianity of being secret Jews, of Judaizing. But Reueveni never converted to Christianity. I think he's the only unconverted Jew, who was ever prosecuted by the Inquisition, although I could be wrong. And he's prosecuted under the only possible charge, and that's of preaching Judaism to Christians, by which they mean his relations with these conversos who he's been cultivating. So he's convicted, and they've shipped him to Spain. We're not quite sure why that happens, but there he is. And the Inquisition never executes people itself. It relaxes them, that's the term, to the secular authorities. And he was burned at the stake in 1538.
And that's really the end. And then we have this diary now. So what's the story of the diary? Where did the diary come from? The manuscript, I think I mentioned this, the manuscript is gone. There is no manuscript today. But yes. Where was the manuscript from? What's the story of the diary?
So it's a remarkable story. We know it's genuine. It's referred to in some Inquisition documents. There was a prospective converso professor of Hebrew at the University of Salamanca in the early 17th century. And when he was accused of Judaizing, he mentioned that he read this diary of David Reuveni. So we know it's genuine. The next time we hear of the manuscript is in the 19th century. It shows up in this German book collector's collection. And Leopold Zunz got hold of it, the sort of founder of Wissenschaft des Judentums, modern Jewish studies, got hold of it, and he wrote a short notice of its contents in this article on Jewish geographers, because Reueveni was relevant in that field. The book collector dies. his books get sold to the Bodleian Library, the library in Oxford. And at that point, this interests the diary interested some scholar, and he made a facsimile of the diary. And let me explain what a facsimile is. They didn't have photocopy machines back then, so he takes a piece of tracing paper and he takes a pen and he traces the outline of each letter. So it's not like transcribing it where you're writing it in your own hand. You actually have the actual shape of the letters in the original manuscript. So it's about the best thing you can get if you don't have a photocopy machine or a camera. And then in the late 1860s, the book goes missing. And we just have this facsimile. Now, what can we tell from the facsimile? It's hard to do proper analysis of a facsimile, but we can very clearly see that it looks like a 16th century Jewish hand. I mean, the Hebrew, the style of the script looks very clearly what you would get in 16th century Italy. So that's the story of the manuscript in brief.
So today it's missing, but we have this facsimile. So who first publishes the diary?
So there are a bunch of partial translations. There's a German dissertation which comes out with parts of the diary, but Neubauer does a complete version of the diary, and then the version that I've used is that of Eschkoli. Is it better than Neubauer's? Probably not, but it's the version that everyone uses, and I've compared to Neubauer where necessary.
Right, that was the Hebrew more recent edition, but that's not in print anymore. I don't believe it's around. Mm-hmm. As far as I know, it's not around anymore. But now there's this. So, translation. How'd you come to translating in general? I don't know if we discussed that, but then how did you go about translating this work into English?
So I think that translation is incredibly important, and especially of longer texts. That translating forces you to translate the parts of a book that are interesting to you and that are not interesting to you. When you just translate excerpts or you talk about a text, you get to leave out parts. And I think the great thing about translating long texts is that you don't leave out anything. So I may be interested in the diary because I'm interested in Jewish messianism, but somebody else may be interested in the diary because of its descriptions of the roles of women, in politics and philanthropy around the house and the home and all of that. So that's why I like translating these texts, and I've translated, as you know, texts before. I've translated Chaim Chapshush's Masot Chapshush before. What kinds of texts do I like translating? Difficult ones. So my last book was a translation of a Judeo-Arabic text that was written in a dialect, a Yemeni Jewish dialect of Arabic that is now extinct. So it was a real challenge to translate. Reuveni's diary was challenging in a different way. As I said before, an intermediate student of Hebrew can get the gist fairly easily. But because the grammar is so anarchic, nailing Reuveni down, trying to make each sentence make sense was a different kind of challenge, and that's what really drew me to it. Does that sort of answer the question, or were you looking?
Yeah, no. I think that's interesting, and okay, I think that does. Now, I mean, we just discussed this before. I just want to emphasize this. So, because many people know about this diary. First of all, that's why I wanted to mention that you didn't go crazy with the notes, though. There are end notes, but they're lighter. Was that on purpose? You didn't want to have it very heavy, overburdened with notes?
Yes. So I really feel that this is a text in the past that captured a lot of people's imaginations. There's a huge amount of historical fiction about David Reuveni, and I wanted a broader audience to be able to enjoy him. So I was light on those end notes.
Right, but there are end notes, and there is also an introduction, as I mentioned. But that's the next thing, as you mentioned, there's a lot of historical fiction on him, And I mean, again, like we emphasize, some of this might be fiction. Many people think that, this is the fiction. But you're saying that there are definitely things here we can verify elsewhere that's accurate. I mean, what's your take on it when reading the diary? How historically accurate is it, or just some parts are and we just won't know, or is it not? What's your opinion on it?
So it varies, and I think that Reueveni knew his audience very, very well, and I think that the question is not so much whether it's true, but trying to guess why Reueveni said it. And I think that's the interest of the African part of the diary. You get the feeling that he'd seen other travel literature of the region, and knew what kinds of things worked with an audience and what kinds of things didn't work. And there are a lot of people who don't like Reueveni. So the early scholars who read Reueveni saw him as a fraud. They saw him as this kind of frat boy who threw all of these parties and traveled, and without much regard for the Jewish communities that he passed through, and often with disastrous consequences for them. That it's quite possible that Reuveni's activities brought the Inquisition to Portugal. I mean, that's one claim that scholars do make, that he ultimately caused harm, even if he didn't intend to do so. But there are later readers, especially after World War I, who see Reuveni in a different light, that he is responding to Jewish powerlessness, that he is making a desperate bid to save the Jews. And that's when you get this first flourishing of historical fiction around Reuveni, seeing him as a kind of a Herzl before Herzl. But not exclusively Zionists are interested in him. I mentioned in the book this Daniel Bergelsen, the Yiddish playwright, and he's writing in Soviet Russia during the Holocaust, and he's fully aware of Jews being murdered. And he looks at Reuveni, and he sees a parallel. He says Reuveni engaged in a hopeless task, but with the belief that as long as somebody is fighting, they're still alive. That's it. So it's a statement for life. And he was an anti-Zionist, Bergelsen. He supported Stalin's autonomous Jewish oblast in Azerbaijan, but he was attracted to Reuveni making this perhaps hopeless bid, just so as not to cave to all the powers that sought to extinguish Judaism in his age. So I found that very, very interesting, that reception of Reuveni.
So finally, I mean, you translated this, you worked on this. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you think there's a point, but what is the point? What can readers gain from reading this diary now?
So I think there are various things. I think that the fundamental. I'm writing a full biography of David Reuveni right now. And I want to change the way the early 16th century is viewed. That it's not an area that's focused on a lot by historians, and to the extent that historians talk about it, it's just about this transition of Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula to the Ottoman Empire. And I think that Reuveni is a really good text for seeing the level of uncertainty, the level of fear that was going on in these moments immediately after 1492. The kinds of despair, the kinds of desperate schemes that Jews were forced to cook up to deal with some of the political events of the period. I also think it's very interesting to look at Reuveni's strategies for negotiation, that he's seeing this great power game that is being played by Christians and Muslims. He's seeing these new geographical knowledge is being circulated. He's looking at this age of discovery, and he's trying to cook up a Jewish answer to what Muslims and Christians are doing in this time period. So seeing the text as being in dialogue with some of the most important geopolitical events of the period, I think is key to really enjoying it. I also think it's just a great literary text. I think that there's a story there. I see it as a how-to guide to being a messianic claimant. You just don't get texts like this. Texts are filled with, when we look at messianic texts, they're filled with Kabbalah and with theological aspects. Reuveni is interested in sermons, in servants' salaries, how you manage your entourage, who you bribe. He has a list of expenses at the end of his book. It's this very mundane approach to the end of time, which I find just fascinating and really grabbed me.
And I mentioned this before. It's a really fun read. It's really enjoyable. Your translation is very readable, and so I'll put a link in the show's notes, and listeners, people should check it out. It's a great read. If anyone's interested, especially in that time period, it's really just an enjoyable read. So, the last thing I'll just ask you: is there any further reading though besides the diary? If anybody's interested in reading up on more about Reueveni, is there anywhere you can point them that they should read?
So, in terms of the 16th century, there's a wonderful book by Jonathan Ray called After Expulsion. And it's a really short book, but a wonderful overview about what's going on in the 16th century. In terms of Reueveni himself, there is not all that much, but Moti Ben Melech has written a biography of Shlomo Molcho, and unfortunately, it's only in Hebrew at the moment. I hope it gets translated into English. And it deals with Reueveni as well, but these are two interlinked characters, so that's definitely worthwhile reading too. And maybe I'll leave it there. But if anyone wants to contact me about a specific topic within Reueveni, email me. You can find me on by Googling me, and I'm happy to answer with a more specific bibliography.
Yeah, exactly. They can reach out to me for your email, or like you said, check online. They can find your email. So I'll link to Professor Ray after expulsion. I actually did a podcast episode with him. I don't know if it's going to come out before or after this one, so I'll just say that here for the listeners. They can check that out, as well as Moti Ben Melech. I did a podcast episode with him, and as well as I can link to his book and his academia page. He has some things, I think, on Reueveni written in English. I think he does have an article or two in English, but the book itself on Molcho, which is phenomenal, is in Hebrew. It's not, like I said, I hope it gets to English. It should. It's terrific. But there are some things on Reueveni he has in English. I'll link to his academia page. It should be available there. And thank you, Professor Verskin, for joining me to discuss David Reuveni and his diary.
Thank you so much for having me.